the family dinner where my mother once again told me I just needed to be patient and stop obsessing over money. I set a folder down between the serving dishes and said, I want to talk about the $90,000 of debt in my name that I never borrowed, in front of everyone, because I finally pulled every account and I have the original applications now, and I recognize the handwriting on them. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before, and my brother, the golden one, went very, very still. Let me back up. Because to understand how I reached 31 years old, carrying $90,000 of debt I'd never known existed. You have to understand a family that treated one daughter as a person and one daughter as a resource. And you have to understand that the resource they took from me wasn't just money. It was my name, my credit, my identity. My future, borrowed against before I was old enough to know what credit was. My name is Adiz Akafer. I'm 33 years old now. And for 14 years, my parents secretly used my identity to take out loans and credit, starting when I was 17, to fund my older brother's life while telling me my financial struggles were my own fault and that I just needed to be more responsible. This is the story of how I discovered it, what it had cost me, and what happens when the people who stole your future are the same people who gave you life. Let me tell you about my family. I grew up in a household with a clear and unspoken hierarchy, the kind so many families have and so few admit to. My older brother Chitty was the star, the son, the firstborn, the one whose future was the family's central project. Everything bent toward Chitty. His education, his opportunities, his ambitions, these were treated as investments the whole family was obligated to make. And I was the daughter, the second child, and while my parents loved me, I understood early that in the economy of our family, I was not an investment. I was, at best, a contributor to Chitty's investment. My role was to support, to sacrifice, to make do, so that Chitty could rise. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to paint my parents as monsters, and they weren't, not simply. They were immigrants who'd sacrificed enormously, who carried a specific cultural weight around the firstborn son, who genuinely believed they were doing right by investing everything in Chitty, because Chitty's success would, in the old logic, lift the whole family. I understand the machine they were inside. Understanding it doesn't undo what it did to me, but I want you to know it wasn't cartoon villainy. It was something more common and more insidious. Ordinary favoritism, culturally sanctioned, escalating over years into something criminal, without anyone ever quite deciding to become criminals. Here is what they did, though I wouldn't understand the full shape of it for 14 years. When I was 17, and had a clean credit history simply by virtue of being a young person with a valid social security number and no debts, my parents began using my identity to borrow money. It started, I'd later piece together, with a credit card in my name. Open when I was 17, using my information, which they had complete access to as my parents. Chitty needed things, tuition beyond what scholarships covered, a car, the accoutrements of the rising young man the family was building. And my parents, stretched thin by their all-in investment in Chitty, found a resource with pristine credit and no idea it was being used, me. For the years that followed, it escalated. More credit cards, personal loans, and eventually this was the one that finally broke everything open. A substantial loan, tens of thousands of dollars secured against my name and credit to fund a business venture of Chitty's. All told, by the time I was 31, there was $90,000 of debt in my name that I had never knowingly taken out, accumulated over 14 years, every dollar of it spent on my brother. And here is the emotional heart of it, the thing that makes this different from a stranger stealing your identity. My parents didn't just take my credit. They took it while telling me my life's difficulties were my own fault. Because throughout those years, I struggled financially in ways I couldn't understand. I was careful with money I'd learned to be, growing up as the non-investment child. I paid my bills. I saved when I could. And yet my financial life was inexplicably hard. My credit was strangely bad despite my carefulness. I got denied for things I should have qualified for. I paid higher interest rates, got worse terms, faced obstacles that didn't match my actual behavior. And every time I raised this with my family, every time I said, I don't understand why my credit is so bad, I'm so careful, my mother would tell me I needed to be more responsible, that I was probably forgetting bills. That I obsessed over money, too much that I should stop worrying and be patient. They were gaslighting me about the consequences of their own theft. They sabotaged my credit by borrowing against it, and then, when I noticed the damage, they told me the damage was my own fault, my own carelessness, my own failure to be responsible. For years I carried a low-grade shame about my inexplicable financial struggles, believing I was somehow bad with money despite all evidence of my carefulness, when the truth was that my own parents had been quietly wrecking my credit for over a decade to fund my brother, and then blaming me for the wreckage. Let me tell you about the subplot that first made me suspect, because I didn't figure it out alone. My grandfather planted the seed, years before I understood it. My grandfather, my father's father, a shrewd old man who'd watched his son's family with a clear and sometimes disapproving eye, said something to me when I was in my 20s that I didn't understand until much later. We were talking about money, about my strange struggles, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, Adiz, when you have trouble you can't explain, look at who benefits. The money doesn't vanish. It goes somewhere. Someone always benefits. And then he said, more quietly, almost to himself, I told your father years ago that what he was doing would come back on him. He didn't listen. He never listens about Chitty. I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't say more. He was old and loyal to his son in the complicated way of fathers, and he wouldn't accuse my father directly. But he'd planned it, what your father was doing. Someone always benefits. I filed it away, not understanding, and my grandfather died a few years later without ever explaining. But his words sat in me, and when the truth finally surfaced, they were the first thing I thought of. He'd known. He'd tried, in his oblique old man way, to point me toward it. He just couldn't bring himself to turn his son into his granddaughter. Now let me tell you how it finally came apart, because it came apart the way these things do, when the accumulated damage finally hit a wall too big to gaslight away. I was 31, and I was buying a house. It was the culmination of everything: years of careful saving, a stable career as a nurse, a down payment I'd built with real discipline. And I applied for a mortgage, and I was denied. Flatly, completely denied. I sat in the loan officer's office while she walked me through my credit report, and the world tilted. Because the report showed $90,000 of debt across accounts I had never opened. Credit cards going back to when I was 17. Personal loans, a large business loan. Delinquencies, mispayments, a credit score in ruins, all attached to accounts I had never knowingly created, spanning 14 years. "Ms. Ackhaffer," the loan officer said carefully, "is it possible you've been a victim of identity theft?" And I said the thing that had been true my whole financial life without my knowing it. Yes, I think I have, for a very long time. But even as I said it, a cold understanding was forming. Because identity theft by a stranger doesn't span 14 years, doesn't start when you're 17, doesn't go unnoticed because it never quite triggers the alerts a stranger's fraud would. This was intimate. This was someone with complete, ongoing access to my personal information. This was someone who'd had my social security number since I was born, who could intercept the mail, who could keep the accounts just functional enough to avoid detection while wrecking my credit underneath. This wasn't a stranger. I drove home, and I did the thing I'd never done because I'd never known to do it. I pulled everything. Full credit reports from all 3 bureaus. And then, using my rights as the victim, I requested the original applications for every fraudulent account, because you have the right to those, and almost nobody knows it. And when the applications arrived, I found my parents. The applications, some of them, were on paper. And on the paper ones was handwriting I had seen my entire life. My mother's handwriting, filling out a credit application in my name when I was 17. My father's handwriting on a loan document. The addresses were my parents' address. The phone numbers were my parents' numbers. There was no ambiguity, no possibility of a stranger. My own parents had filled out these applications, in their own hands, using their own child's identity, and had been doing it for 14 years. I want to describe what that felt like, because the $90,000 was almost the smaller wound. The larger wound was this. My parents had looked at their 17-year-old daughter, a child, their child, and seen a financial resource to be harvested for their son. He had taken my name, my future, my creditworthiness, the invisible foundation a young person builds their whole adult life on, and they had spent it on Chitty. And then they had watched me struggle for years under the damage and told me the struggle was my own fault. Every time I'd said, "I don't understand why my credit is bad," they'd known exactly why, and they'd let me carry the shame of it because the alternative was admitting what they'd done. They'd stolen my future and charged me my self-respect as interest. Let me tell you about the midpoint, the moment the family tried to make me let it go, because it's the moment that hardened me. I didn't go nuclear immediately. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct, the instinct of the non-investment daughter trained her whole life to keep the peace, was to handle it quietly within the family. So I went to my parents privately, and I told them what I'd found, and I gave them the chance to explain, to apologize, to make it right. And they did not apologize. That was the moment that changed everything. My mother, faced with the applications in her own handwriting, did not express remorse. She expressed grievance. She told me that everything they'd done for the family. That Chitty's success was the family's success, and I should be proud to have contributed. That I was being selfish and Western and ungrateful to make an issue of it, to prioritize my own credit score over my brother's future, over the family's collective good. She reframed 14 years of identity theft as a contribution I should be honored to have made. And my father sat silent and let her, and Chitty, who had lived his entire adult life on debt stolen from his sister, said I was tearing the family apart over money. They told me to let it go. To absorb the $90,000 as my contribution to the family. To be patient and stop obsessing over money one more time, except now I knew what those words had always meant. They meant, keep quiet while we rob you. And in that moment, something in me that had spent 31 years being the non-investment child, the contributor, the one who made do so Chitty could rise, finally broke. Because I understood that if I let this go, if I absorbed the debt and kept the peace as I'd always kept the peace, I would be ratifying a lifetime of being treated as a resource instead of a person. I would be agreeing that my parents had the right to take my name and my future and spend them on my brother. I would be teaching them, and myself, that there was no limit to what could be extracted from me in the name of family. And I would be doing it while carrying $90,000 of ruined credit that would follow me for years. I was not going to let it go, but I also understood that going to my parents privately had failed. Exactly as going to people privately always fails in these stories, because privately they could reframe and guilt and gaslight, and the whole family, fed my mother's version, would treat me as the ungrateful daughter tearing the family apart over money. I needed to do what finally works, put the undeniable truth in front of everyone at once so it couldn't be reframed. But first, I had to do the hard, cold thing that the situation actually required, and it was the hardest decision of my life. Here is the terrible mechanics of identity theft by a family member, the thing no one tells you. To clear the fraudulent debt from your credit to prove it wasn't yours. You generally have to formally declare it fraud, and formally declaring that someone used your identity without authorization is functionally reporting a crime. To save myself financially, I would have to file reports that named my own parents as the perpetrators of identity theft. There was no way to clear my name that didn't involve, on some level, turning in the people who gave me life. The system doesn't have a gentle option for my parents robbed me, but I don't want them prosecuted. To get the debt off my credit, I had to say, officially in writing, I did not authorize these accounts. They were opened fraudulently by these people. I agonized over it for weeks. And what decided me, finally, was a hard clarity. My parents had put me in this position. They were the ones who'd committed the crime. The impossible choice I faced, clear my name and report my parents, or protect my parents and carry $90,000 of their theft forever, was a choice they had created, not me. I hadn't done anything wrong. They had. And I was done sacrificing myself to protect people who'd spent 14 years sacrificing me. I consulted a lawyer and an identity theft specialist, and I built the case properly. And I made the decision to have it out in the open in front of the whole family. Before I filed, not to threaten them into silence, but so that the truth would be witnessed, so my mother couldn't run her ungrateful Western daughter, narrative unopposed, so the family would understand what had actually happened before the version spinning began. Let me tell you about the dinner. Family gathering, the extended family present, and my mother, not knowing what I'd assembled, once again deployed the line she'd used my whole life, telling me in front of everyone that I needed to be patient and stop obsessing over money. She said it to shame me, to reassert the old dynamic, to remind everyone that I was the difficult daughter who fixated on finances. And I set a folder down between the serving dishes. I want to talk about the $90,000 of debt in my name that I never borrowed, I said, in front of everyone, because I finally pulled every account, and I have the original applications now, and I recognize the handwriting on them. The room went still. My father's fork stopped. My mother's face changed. Chitty went rigid. When I was 17, I said to the whole table, someone opened a credit card in my name. Since then, over 14 years, that grew to $90,000 of debt across accounts I never knew existed. I found out last month, when I was denied a mortgage on a house I'd saved for years to buy. I thought I'd been a victim of identity theft by a stranger. Then I pulled the original applications. I opened the folder. This is a credit application from 14 years ago in my name, in Mom's handwriting. This is a loan document in Dad's handwriting. The address is this house. The phone numbers are Mom and Dad's. There's no stranger. My own parents have been borrowing against my identity since I was 17, and every dollar of it went to Chitty. The extended family was staring. My aunt made a small sound, and I kept going because I needed all of it in the room. And here's the part that I need everyone to understand, because it's worse than the money. For years, I struggled financially and couldn't understand why. My credit was inexplicably bad even though I was careful. And every time I said, I don't understand why my credit is so bad, my mother told me I needed to be more responsible, that I obsessed over money, that I should be patient, the exact words she used tonight. They knew why my credit was bad. They'd wrecked it, and they let me carry the shame of it for years rather than admit what they'd done. They didn't just steal my future. They made me believe the damage was my own fault. My mother reached for her weapon, the one that had always worked. Everything we did for this family, for Chitty, you should be proud to have. Proud to have my identity stolen. I said, Mom, I went to you privately first. I gave you the chance to apologize, to make it right, to treat me like a daughter instead of a resource. And you told me I was selfish and ungrateful for objecting to 14 years of identity theft. So I'm not doing this privately anymore, because privately you get to tell everyone I'm the ungrateful daughter tearing the family apart over money. I want everyone to hear the truth first. I am not tearing this family apart. You tore it apart when you decided your daughter's future was raw material for your sons. And then my grandfather's ghost spoke through me because I'd finally understood him. Grandpa told me once, I said, when you have trouble you can't explain, look at who benefits. He knew. He tried to tell me years ago and he couldn't bring himself to turn in his own son. So he pointed and hoped I'd figure it out. I finally did. The money didn't vanish. It went somewhere. It went to Chitty. It always went to Chitty. That was the whole architecture of this family, and it was built on my name. Here is how it ended. It ended hard, and I won't pretend it ended cleanly, because a story where you have to report your own parents to save yourself does not have a clean ending. I filed the reports. I had to. There was no other way to clear $90,000 of fraudulent debt from my credit, and I was not going to carry my parents' theft for the rest of my life to protect them from consequences they had chosen by committing the crime. Formally declaring the accounts fraudulent, which required naming the perpetrators, did what it does. It triggered a process. I'm not going to detail the legal aftermath because it's painful and private, and it's my family's, but I'll say that identity theft is a serious crime especially when it's committed by a parent against a child, and that there were real consequences, and that living with having been the one to set them in motion is a weight I still carry. But the debt came off my credit. All of it. Because once the fraud was documented, the applications in my parents' handwriting, the whole 14-year pattern, there was no question it wasn't mine. My credit recovered, faster than I'd feared, because a documented fraud case is the fastest credit repair there is. I bought the house. Different one in the end, but a house, mine, bought with credit that finally reflected the careful person I'd always actually been. My relationship with my parents did not survive, and I've had to make a kind of peace with that, which is more like an ongoing grief than a resolution. I never truly apologized. To the end, my mother experienced my refusal to absorb the theft as my betrayal of the family. My father hid behind her. And Chitty, who lived his whole life on my stolen credit, decided I was vindictive. Some of the extended family, unable to face what my parents had done, sided with them, because it was easier to believe I was ungrateful than to believe two parents had robbed their own child for 14 years. I let them go, but others didn't. My aunt, my mother's sister, came to me afterward, devastated, and said the words that mattered. They did this to you, and they made you feel like it was your fault, and I watched you struggle for years and never once imagined. I'm so sorry. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. And a few of my cousins and my grandfather's memory and the family members who could face the truth, they became a smaller, truer family, the one I have now. The grandfather subplot is the piece I hold on to. Because my grandfather had known, or suspected, and had tried in his limited, loyal, oblique way to steer me toward the truth, look at who benefits, and had died before he could see me find it. I like to think he'd be glad. That the seed he planted, unable to say more, finally grew into the understanding that saved me. He couldn't turn in his son, but he could point his granddaughter toward the light and trust her to walk to it. I walked to it. Late, but I walked to it. For 14 years, my parents used my identity to fund my brother, starting when I was 17, and then told me my financial struggles were my own fault. They stole the most intangible thing a person has, not money, but the invisible foundation of creditworthiness and identity that a young person builds their whole adult life on. They spent my future before I was old enough to know I had one. And then they gaslit me about the wreckage, let me carry the shame of struggles they had manufactured, and when I finally discovered it, they told me I was ungrateful for objecting to being robbed. The cruelest part was never the $90,000. It was the 14 years of believing I was bad with money, bad with responsibility, somehow inexplicably failing at a financial life I was actually careful about, when the truth was that I had been careful and good and responsible. My own parents had been quietly destroying the evidence of it to fund my brother and blaming me for the destruction. I got my credit back. I got my house. And most importantly, I got back the truth about myself, that I was never bad with money. I was robbed. There's a world of difference between those two things, and my parents spent 14 years making sure I lived on the wrong side of it. Grandpa was right. The money never vanished. It always went somewhere. It always went to Chitty. I just had to become the one person in the family willing to follow it, even when the trail led to the two people I'd been taught, above all others, never to hold accountable. I followed it anyway. Because a daughter is not a resource, and a name is not a family's to spend, and being born second does not mean being born to be harvested. I was never the ungrateful one. I was just, finally, the one who counted the cost and refused to keep paying it.